The Boeing 737 MAX shuddered at 37,000 feet, and Captain Marcus Webb felt his stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with turbulence. The master caution light bathed the cockpit in amber hell, and every system warning seemed to scream at once. Hydraulic failure, flight control malfunction, engine parameters fluctuating wildly. 23 years of commercial flying, and Webb had never seen a cascade failure this severe. United 2847, this is Minneapolis Center. We're showing multiple system failures on your transponder. State your intentions. Webb's hands trembled as he keyed the radio. His first officer, barely 30 and green as spring grass, was frantically flipping through emergency checklists with the desperate intensity of a man drowning in procedures. The aircraft bucked like an angry horse, fighting every input from the flight controls. Minneapolis Center, United 2847 declaring emergency. Multiple system failures, flight controls compromised. We need vectors to nearest suitable airport. The radio crackled back immediately. United 2847, copy emergency. Duluth International is 60 miles northeast, weather clear, runway 3 available. Emergency equipment standing by. But Webb knew something the controller didn't, something that made his mouth go dry as desert sand. The backup hydraulic system was gone. The electric trim was intermittent, and the rudder felt like it was fighting him with a mind of its own. This wasn't just an emergency. This was the kind of scenario that ended up as case studies in aviation accident investigation courses. Behind him, 180 passengers went about their business, most unaware that death was riding shotgun in the cockpit. A businessman typed on his laptop. A mother fed her infant. An elderly couple played cards. And in row 6, seat A, someone slept peacefully against the window, a worn military surplus jacket draped over her shoulders like a security blanket. The aircraft lurched violently to the right, and Webb had to use both hands on the yoke to bring it back to level flight. His first officer looked at him with eyes wide as dinner plates, and Webb saw his own fear reflected there. They were running out of options faster than fuel through a severed line. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Webb's voice was steady, professional, betraying none of the panic clawing at his chest. We're experiencing some technical difficulties and will be making an unscheduled landing in Duluth. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for an emergency landing. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Webb turned to his first officer, voice barely above a whisper. Get on the PA. Ask if there are any military pilots on board. Right now, we need all the help we can get. In row 6, Callsign Reaper was already awake. Major Katerina, Kat, Voss had been dreaming of the Hindu Kush again, that endless expanse of jagged mountains where she'd earned her call sign and lost pieces of her soul. The slight change in engine harmonics had pulled her from sleep with the instant alertness of someone who'd learned that survival meant never truly resting. Her pale green eyes opened to assess the cabin, noting the subtle signs of distress among the flight attendants, the way they moved with barely controlled urgency. She'd felt the aircraft's abnormal behavior through her bones, the slight yaw, the overcorrection, the way it settled into level flight like an injured bird fighting to stay aloft. 22 years of military flying had taught her to read an aircraft's distress signals like a doctor reading symptoms. This bird was dying. The PA crackled to life, the first officer's voice tight with barely controlled panic. Ladies and gentlemen, if there are any military pilots aboard this aircraft, please ring your call button or contact a flight attendant immediately. Around her, passengers began to murmur, their comfortable delusion of routine air travel shattered. A few heads turned, looking for anyone who might stand up, might step forward and magically fix whatever was going wrong. But Kat remained motionless, her jaw set in a line harder than titanium. She'd left that life behind. The uniform, the responsibility, the weight of other people's lives in her hands. She'd walked away from all of it after that final mission over the Koringal Valley. After watching her wingman's F-16 disintegrate in a ball of fire and metal because she'd made the wrong call, trusted the wrong intelligence, led him into an ambush that should have been obvious. The flight attendant, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and hands that shook just slightly, stopped at her row. "Ma'am, we're looking for anyone with military flight experience. Are you?" Kat's fingers found the small silver wings pinned to her jacket collar, the wings she'd earned 12 years ago when she was young, and believed she could save the world one sortie at a time. Before Kandahar, before the nightmares, before the discharge papers that came with a Purple Heart and a medical retirement she'd never wanted. "I'm not active duty," she said quietly, her voice carrying the flat precision of someone who'd given too many after-action reports to too many superior officers who'd never seen combat. The flight attendant's face fell, but before she could move on, Kat reached out and caught her wrist gently. The aircraft shuddered again, more violently this time, and she could hear the change in engine note that meant they were losing power. "But I know how to fly." The cockpit of United 2847 felt smaller than a coffin when Kat squeezed through the door. Captain Webb looked like he'd aged a decade in the past 10 minutes, his uniform shirt soaked with sweat despite the cool air conditioning. His first officer was pale as moonlight, hands moving over controls with the jerky desperation of a puppet whose strings were tangled. "Thank God," Webb breathed when he saw her. "I'm Captain Webb, you military." Major Katerina Voss, Air Force, retired. She slid into the observer's seat, her eyes already scanning the instrument panel with the systematic precision of a fighter pilot. Warning lights painted the cockpit in a Christmas display of red and amber. Hydraulic pressure, 0. Flight control computers, degraded. Engine parameters, fluctuating. "What's our situation, Captain?" Webb's voice cracked slightly. "Complete hydraulic failure. Flight controls are barely responding. We've got maybe 20 minutes of fuel and Duluth is our only option. But I've never landed anything this size without hydraulics." Kat's hands found the backup flight controls, feeling the aircraft's responses through her fingertips like a doctor taking a pulse. The 737 was fighting them, every input delayed and uncertain. But underneath the mechanical trauma, she could feel something else, the basic bones of flight, the fundamental relationship between wing and air that had kept her alive through 2 combat tours. "I have," she said quietly. Webb turned to stare at her, hope flickering in his exhausted eyes like a candle flame in wind. "You've landed a 737 without hydraulics." "No," Kat's voice was steady as bedrock. "But I've brought home aircraft that were more whole than metal, with systems that existed only in memory and prayers. The principles are the same." She keyed the radio, her voice cutting through the static with crisp authority. "Minneapolis Center, United 2847. Be advised we have military flight expertise in the cockpit. Request direct vector to Duluth and emergency equipment standing by." United 2847, copy. Military assistance acknowledged. Vector 45, Duluth International 42 miles. Emergency equipment is rolling. Kat's hands moved over the controls with practiced efficiency, feeling the aircraft's responses, learning its new language of compromise and limitation. This wasn't her F-16, responsive as a thoroughbred racehorse. This was a wounded elephant, massive and unwieldy, but still capable of flight if handled with the right combination of skill and intuition. "Tell me about your flight envelope," she said to Webb. "How does she handle with minimal control authority?" The next few minutes became a crash course in emergency aviation, 2 professionals sharing knowledge across the divide between civilian and military flying. The approach to Duluth International looked like something from a pilot's worst nightmare. Runway 3 stretched before them like a gray ribbon, but without proper hydraulics, every control input was a negotiation rather than a command. Kat had taken primary flight controls, her hands light on the yoke, feeling for the aircraft's rhythm like a musician finding the beat. United 2847, Duluth Tower. Wind calm, runway 3 clear, emergency equipment standing by. You're cleared for emergency approach. Duluth Tower, United 2847. Beginning final approach. Souls on board 183. The number hung in the air between them. 183 people whose lives now depended on Kat's ability to translate 22 years of military flying into the civilian world of heavy metal and passenger comfort. She could feel Webb's eyes on her, could sense the first officer's barely controlled panic, but her world had narrowed to the essential elements of flight: airspeed, altitude, runway alignment, and the delicate dance between gravity and lift. "Flaps to 20, she called, her voice carrying the calm authority that had once guided bombing runs over Taliban strongholds. "Engine power back to 60%. We're going to ride this one down like a controlled crash." The 737 responded sluggishly, wallowing through the air like a wounded whale. Without hydraulics, the flight controls felt loose and unpredictable, every input delayed by mechanical compromise. But Kat had flown aircraft held together by duct tape and determination, had nursed damaged birds home through mountain passes where a single mistake meant death. 200 feet, Webb called, reading off altitudes. 150, 100. The runway rose to meet them, concrete rushing past the windscreen with the terrible finality of Earth meeting sky. Kat pulled power back to idle, felt the aircraft settle into ground effect, that cushion of disturbed air that lived between flight and landing. 50 feet, 30, 20. The main landing gear touched with a screech of rubber and the groaning protest of overstressed metal. The aircraft bounced once, settled, and Kat found herself fighting to keep the nose straight as they decelerated. No reverse thrust with the damaged systems. No normal braking. Just aerodynamic drag and whatever friction she could coax from the remaining hydraulics. "We're down," Webb breathed, his voice thick with disbelief and gratitude. The emergency vehicles were already rolling, red and blue lights painting the afternoon sky like a celebration of survival. The Duluth Airport terminal felt surreal after the focused intensity of the cockpit. Kat stood near the window, watching the 737 being surrounded by investigators and maintenance crews, their purposeful movement reminding her of medics working on a battlefield casualty. The aircraft looked smaller on the ground, somehow diminished, its heroic struggle reduced to bent metal and hydraulic fluid stains on concrete. Captain Webb approached with 2 cups of coffee and the shell-shocked expression of a man who just stared death in the face and won by the narrowest of margins. "The NTSB wants to interview you," he said, offering her one of the cups. "Along with the media, the airline, and probably half the aviation world." Kat accepted the coffee but didn't drink it. The ceramic mug felt strange in her hands after the tactile precision of flight controls. "I'm not interested in interviews." "Why?" Webb's question was gentle, curious rather than demanding. "You just saved 183 lives. That's hero stuff." The word hero landed like a punch to her solar plexus. Heroes didn't let their wingmen fly into ambushes. Heroes didn't spend 3 years in therapy trying to sleep without seeing their squadron mate's aircraft exploding in slow motion. Heroes didn't take medical retirement because they couldn't trust their own judgment anymore. "Heroes don't abandon their responsibilities," she said quietly, her green eyes fixed on the distant mountains. "They don't walk away when people need them." Webb was quiet for a long moment, studying her profile against the window. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Sometimes walking away is the most responsible thing you can do, and sometimes coming back is the most heroic." Through the terminal speakers, a news anchor was already spinning the story. "Commercial airliner makes emergency landing at Duluth International after catastrophic system failure. Passengers and crew reported safe thanks to the intervention of a retired military pilot who happened to be aboard the aircraft. Kat closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of unwanted attention settling on her shoulders like an old, uncomfortable coat. She'd spent 3 years building a quiet life, working as a flight instructor at a small airport in Montana, teaching teenagers and weekend warriors the basics of flight. No pressure, no life-or-death decisions, no one depending on her for anything more critical than proper landing technique. Major Voss. She turned to find a young woman in an NTSB windbreaker, all professional competence and barely contained excitement. The investigator had that look Kat remembered from her own early career, the hunger to understand, to dissect every detail of what had gone wrong and what had gone right. The debriefing took 2 hours, every detail of the emergency approach dissected and analyzed with the methodical precision of a forensic examination. Kat answered questions with military brevity, her responses technically accurate but emotionally flat. She described control inputs and aircraft responses, airspeed and altitude parameters, the mechanical realities of flying a damaged bird. But she couldn't describe the moment when her hands had found their old confidence, when 22 years of training and experience had crystallized into the pure essence of flight. She couldn't explain how it felt to trust herself again, even for those crucial minutes between crisis and resolution. The NTSB investigator finally closed her notebook, satisfied with the technical details but clearly sensing there was more to the story. "One more question, Major. What made you decide to help? You could have stayed in your seat." Kat was quiet for a long moment, remembering the weight of those silver wings on her jacket collar, the promise they represented. "Sometimes," she said finally, "running away just gets you tired. Sometimes you have to remember who you used to be." The hotel room in Duluth was standard government-approved lodging, beige walls, industrial carpet, and air conditioning that hummed with mechanical persistence. Kat sat on the edge of the bed, her laptop open to an email that had been waiting for her when she'd finally escaped the airport chaos. The sender was Colonel James Morrison, her former commanding officer, and the man who'd signed her medical retirement papers 3 years ago. The subject line was simple: "Proud of you, Reaper." She'd stared at her old call sign for 10 minutes before opening the message. Reaper had been born over Afghanistan, earned during her 3rd deployment when she developed an uncanny ability to find and eliminate high-value targets. Taliban commanders had learned to fear the distinctive whistle of her F-16's engines, had begun calling her the ghost who brings death. Her squadron had shortened it to Reaper, and the name had stuck through 2 more deployments and countless missions. But the last time she'd heard it spoken aloud was during the inquiry following Lieutenant Michael Torch Patterson's death. Her wingman, her responsibility, her failure. Morrison's email was brief. "Saw the news coverage of your emergency landing. Typical Reaper, in the right place at the right time with the right skills. The Air Force could use pilots like you back in the cockpit. We've got new programs, new opportunities. Call me when you're ready to come home." Come home. As if the military were a place rather than a state of mind, as if she could simply walk back into the world she'd abandoned and find it unchanged. But Kat knew better. Wars had ended and new ones had begun. Her squadron had been reassigned. The young pilots she'd trained were now squadron leaders themselves, carrying their own responsibilities and their own ghosts. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Major Voss, this is Captain Webb. I wanted to thank you again for today. You saved my career along with all those lives. If you ever need anything, anything at all, you have my number." She deleted the message without responding. Gratitude was another weight she didn't know how to carry, another reminder of the gap between who she used to be and who she'd become. Outside her window, commercial aircraft moved through the night sky like mechanical stars, their navigation lights blinking in the steady rhythm of routine flight. Somewhere out there, military pilots were flying combat missions, making split-second decisions that balanced tactical necessity against human cost. They carried the same burden she'd once borne, the weight of other people's lives measured against mission objectives and acceptable losses. Kat closed the laptop and lay back on the hotel bed, staring at the ceiling tiles and listening to the distant hum of aircraft engines. For the first time in 3 years, she dreamed of flying without nightmares. The Montana sky stretched endless and blue above Silver Creek Regional Airport, the kind of high-altitude clarity that made every mountain peak look close enough to touch. Kat stood beside her Piper Cherokee trainer, watching her student, a 16-year-old ranch kid named Tommy Garrison, complete his pre-flight inspection with the methodical care she drilled into all her students. "Oil level," she called. "6 quarts within limits," Tommy replied, his voice carrying the prairie drawl of eastern Montana. "Fuel, 38 gallons total, tabs showing full." It had been a week since Duluth, since the emergency landing that had made her briefly famous and thoroughly uncomfortable. The media attention had finally died down, helped by her refusal to grant interviews or appear on the talk shows that had clamored for her story. The Aviation Week article had been respectful but distant, focusing on the technical aspects of the emergency rather than the personal drama the television producers had wanted. But the phone calls hadn't stopped. Air Force recruiting, commercial airlines, defense contractors looking for test pilots. Even NASA had reached out, something about a new program for experienced military pilots. She deleted most of the messages without listening to them completely. This was where she belonged now, teaching basic flight principles to kids who dreamed of the sky but had no concept of its darker possibilities. No life-or-death decisions. No split-second choices between bad options and worse ones. Just the pure, clean mechanics of lift and thrust, the simple joy of leaving the ground behind. "Looks good," she told Tommy as he completed his walk-around. "You ready for solo pattern work?" The kid's face lit up like Christmas morning. He'd been working toward this moment for 6 months, grinding through ground school and dual instruction with the determined focus of someone who'd found his calling. Kat envied him that certainty, that uncomplicated passion for flight. They climbed into the Cherokee, and Kat watched Tommy run through his checklist with practiced precision. He was a natural pilot, smooth on the controls and intuitive about aircraft behavior. In another life, she might have recommended him for military flight training, might have seen him as raw material for a future fighter pilot. But that would have meant sending him into the world she'd left behind, the world of calculated violence and acceptable casualties. Better to let him dream of airline careers or corporate flying, safer ambitions that didn't require him to learn how to kill from 30,000 feet. Silver Creek traffic, Cherokee 739 Delta Yankee, departing runway 27, remaining in the pattern. Tommy's radio work was crisp and professional, another sign of his natural aptitude. The Cherokee lifted off smoothly, climbing into the thin mountain air with the steady confidence of a well-maintained aircraft. Kat watched her student's hands on the controls, remembering her own first solo, the intoxicating freedom of flight without an instructor's presence. The radio crackled. "Cherokee 739 Delta Yankee, this is Silver Creek ground. We have a phone call for your instructor. Emergency contact." Kat felt ice form in her stomach. Emergency calls were rarely good news, and she'd learned to trust her instincts about impending disaster. "Tommy, take us back to the ramp. Full stop landing." "But I was going to practice touch and goes," he protested, his disappointment obvious. "We'll finish your solo work tomorrow. Trust me on this." The phone call was from Colonel Morrison, and his voice carried the weight of official business rather than personal concern. "Kat, I need you to listen carefully. We have a situation developing in the Pacific. Chinese military exercises near Taiwan have gone hot. 2 of their J-20s made an intercept on one of our EP-3 surveillance aircraft, forced it down on a disputed island. The crew is alive but effectively hostages. Kat gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles going white. Jim, I'm retired, medical retirement, whatever you're thinking. The rescue mission requires someone who can fly in contested airspace, someone with experience in both fighter and transport aircraft. The operation is being classified as a humanitarian mission, technically outside normal combat parameters. Morrison's voice was careful, diplomatic. It's volunteer only, but Kat, these kids need someone with your experience. Through the airport office window, she could see Tommy Garrison securing the Cherokee, his movements still careful and precise despite his disappointment about the abbreviated lesson. He represented everything good about aviation: the joy, the freedom, the simple pleasure of defying gravity. The military world Morrison was describing was the opposite: calculation, violence, the reduction of human life to tactical considerations. I can't, she said quietly. Jim, you know why I can't. I know what happened to Torch wasn't your fault. The intelligence was wrong. The mission parameters were flawed from the beginning. You saved your own life by trusting your instincts. I should have saved his life by trusting my instincts sooner. Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Kat, there's a transport crew sitting in Chinese custody right now. 6 airmen whose only mistake was being in the wrong airspace at the wrong time. They're counting on people like us to bring them home. The weight of other people's lives, the burden she'd sworn never to carry again. But as Kat looked out at the endless Montana sky, she could almost hear the voice of her old wingman, Lieutenant Patterson, speaking the words he'd said during their final briefing. Reaper, sometimes you've got to choose between the mission you want and the mission that needs doing. The C-130 Hercules sat on the tarmac at Yokota Air Base like a mechanical monument to American air power, its 4 turboprops silent in the pre-dawn darkness. Kat stood in the shadows of the operations building, wearing a flight suit that felt both foreign and familiar after 3 years of civilian clothes. The fabric carried the scent of institutional laundry and purpose, a smell that triggered muscle memories of briefing rooms and ready rooms across 3 combat deployments. Colonel Morrison emerged from the ops building with a tablet computer and the expression of a man juggling too many variables. At 52, he still carried himself like the fighter pilot he'd once been, but staff work had softened his edges and added gray to his temples. He'd been her mentor during her early career, the officer who'd seen potential in a young woman from rural Iowa who dreamed of flying jets. The mission profile is straightforward, he said without preamble, handing her the tablet. Low-level insertion into disputed airspace, combat search and rescue of 6 aircrew members, extraction before Chinese reinforcements can respond. We go in fast, we get out faster. The tactical display showed the island in question, a chunk of volcanic rock barely 2 miles long, claimed by both Taiwan and mainland China, but currently occupied by neither. The downed EP-3 had made a controlled landing on the island's single airstrip, a legacy of World War II construction that had been abandoned for decades. Intel says the Chinese have a patrol boat circling the island and a destroyer group 12 miles to the west. They're treating this as a sovereignty issue rather than a rescue operation. Morrison's voice was carefully neutral, but Kat could hear the frustration underneath. Washington wants the crew back without starting World War III. Kat studied the mission parameters, her mind automatically calculating fuel loads, flight times, and tactical alternatives. It was a simple CSAR operation, the kind she'd flown dozens of times over Afghanistan and Iraq, but the geopolitical complications made it exponentially more dangerous. What's my aircraft? MC-130J Commando II, Special Operations Variant designed for exactly this kind of mission. The crew is already briefed and ready, but they need someone who can handle the tactical flying. Morrison paused, watching her face carefully. Someone who's been shot at before. The MC-130J was a different beast entirely from the fighters she'd flown in combat. Bigger, slower, but equipped with sophisticated electronics and defensive systems that made it nearly invisible to radar. It was a scalpel rather than a hammer, designed for precision operations in hostile territory. "Jim, what aren't you telling me?" Kat asked, recognizing the careful way he was presenting information. "This feels like more than a simple pickup mission." Morrison was quiet for a moment, then activated a secure display on his tablet. 3 hours ago, one of our satellites picked up movement on the island. The Chinese have landed a small force, maybe a dozen special operations troops. They're not just guarding the crew, they're setting up defensive positions. The tactical situation had just become exponentially more complex. A simple rescue had transformed into a potential firefight, with American aircrew caught in the middle of a face-off between major powers. Any mistake, any escalation, could trigger the kind of international incident that ended careers and started wars. The crew knows about the Chinese presence. Negative, we're maintaining radio silence to avoid compromising their position. As far as they know, this is still a mechanical failure and forced landing. Morrison's expression was grim, but that changes if shooting starts. Kat stared at the tactical display, seeing the mission's complexity unfold in her mind like a chess game played at supersonic speeds. Multiple variables, limited information, and the lives of 6 Americans hanging in the balance. It was exactly the kind of scenario she'd walked away from 3 years ago, the kind of impossible choice between bad options and worse ones. But somewhere on that disputed island, 6 aircrew members were waiting for rescue, depending on people like her to bring them home. They hadn't chosen this fight, hadn't volunteered for international incident status. They were just doing their jobs when geopolitics overtook them. "When do we launch?" she asked. The pre-flight briefing for the MC-130J took place in a windowless room that could have been anywhere in the Air Force. Fluorescent lighting, government tissue furniture, and the kind of acoustic tiles that absorbed sound and personality with equal efficiency. Kat sat at a metal table across from the aircraft's crew, 5 special operations veterans who'd flown missions in every combat theater from Syria to Somalia. Major Rick Santos, the aircraft commander, was a lean Latino with the quiet intensity of someone who'd learned leadership through trial by fire. His co-pilot, Captain Jennifer Liu, looked barely old enough to vote, but carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd earned her place through exceptional skill rather than seniority. The loadmaster, flight engineer, and navigator completed the crew, all sergeants, all combat veterans, all watching Kat with the careful assessment of professionals evaluating a new teammate. "Ma'am, no disrespect," Santos said, "but we've been flying together for 18 months. We know each other's habits, each other's limits. Bringing in an outside pilot for a mission this sensitive." He let the sentence hang unfinished. Kat understood his concern. Crew coordination was everything in special operations, the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. These airmen had developed the kind of wordless communication that came from shared danger and mutual trust. She was an unknown variable in an equation that demanded precision. "Major Santos, I'm not here to take over your aircraft or second-guess your procedures," she said calmly. "I'm here because this mission requires someone who's flown in contested airspace and lived to talk about it. Your crew has the technical expertise. I have the combat experience." Captain Liu leaned forward slightly. "Ma'am, what's your background? We heard you were fighter qualified, but the MC-130 handles differently than a single-seat aircraft." 2 combat deployments in F-16s, 1 in F-15Es. Strike missions, air-to-air combat, and close air support. After that, I cross-trained on transport aircraft for special operations support. Kat's voice was matter-of-fact, reciting qualifications like items on a grocery list. I've flown C-130s in and out of airstrips that existed more in theory than reality. The navigator, a grizzled sergeant named Williams, spoke up. Begging your pardon, ma'am, but this isn't Afghanistan. Chinese air defense systems are state-of-the-art. If they lock us up, we're not outrunning anything in a transport aircraft. It was a fair point. The MC-130J was designed for stealth and electronic warfare rather than raw performance. Against modern fighter aircraft, their only advantages were surprise, electronic countermeasures, and the kind of low-level flying that turned navigation into an art form. Sergeant Williams, you're absolutely right. We can't outrun their fighters, and we can't outgun their air defense systems. Kat pulled up the tactical display on the briefing room's main screen. But we can be where they don't expect us, when they don't expect us, flying lower and quieter than they think possible. She traced the mission route with a laser pointer, highlighting key waypoints and potential threats. We go in at 50 feet above the water, using the island's terrain to mask our approach. No active radar, no radio transmissions, no electronic signatures that might give us away. We land, load the crew, and disappear before anyone knows we were there. Santos studied the route profile, his expression thoughtful. That's some aggressive low-level flying, ma'am. 50 feet over water at night with mountainous terrain. It's what keeps us alive, Kat replied simply. In special operations, the enemy gets a vote in your mission planning. Our job is to make sure they vote with incomplete information. The mission launch window was 36 hours away, timed to coincide with new moon darkness and optimal weather conditions. Until then, the crew would spend their time in final mission preparation and equipment checks, the methodical process that transformed hope into operational reality. As the briefing broke up, Captain Liu approached Kat with a question that had obviously been bothering her. Ma'am, can I ask why you came out of retirement for this mission? From what I heard, you had a good thing going in civilian flying. Kat was quiet for a moment, considering how to explain the pull of duty to someone who'd never walked away from it. Captain, sometimes you think you're done with the mission, but the mission isn't done with you. The MC-130J Commando II felt like a technological cathedral when Kat first stepped aboard. Its cargo bay filled with the sophisticated electronics and defensive systems that made special operations possible. Banks of computers lined the aircraft's walls, their screens displaying real-time intelligence updates and threat assessments. It was a far cry from the stark simplicity of the F-16 cockpits she'd known, where every switch and gauge had served a single, clear purpose. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the flight engineer, gave her a systems briefing that covered everything from defensive countermeasures to emergency procedures. His hands moved over the control panels with the fluid expertise of someone who could operate the aircraft's systems blindfolded, explaining backup systems and failure modes with the methodical precision of a surgeon describing anatomy. The bird's equipped with the latest ALQ-211 electronic warfare suite, he explained, indicating a series of displays that looked like something from a science fiction movie. We can spoof radar signatures, jam communications, even create false targets if things get hot. But ma'am, if we're doing our job right, nobody should know we're there until we're already gone. The flight controls felt familiar despite the aircraft's size and complexity. The MC-130J was still fundamentally a C-130, sharing the basic flight characteristics that had made the Hercules family successful for over 60 years. But the special operations modifications gave it capabilities that transformed it from a simple transport into something approaching a magic carpet. Terrain-following radar can take us down to 200 feet automatically, Santos explained as they ran through pre-flight checks. But for this mission, we'll be hand-flying below the radar coverage, using night vision and terrain mapping. Captain Liu occupied the right seat with the calm professionalism Kat had learned to associate with exceptional pilots. Her hands moved over the instrument panels with practiced efficiency, checking systems, and calling out readings in the precise terminology of military aviation. Despite her youth, she flew with the confidence of someone who'd earned her place through demonstrated competence rather than simple qualification. Navigation systems show green across the board, Liu reported. GPS primary and backup, inertial navigation cross-checked, terrain database current as of this morning's update. The intelligence briefing arrived via secure data link 2 hours before launch, and the news wasn't encouraging. Chinese naval forces had increased their patrol activity around the disputed island, with 2 additional destroyers joining the task force. Satellite imagery showed increased defensive positions around the downed EP-3, suggesting the Chinese Special Operations Team was preparing for exactly the kind of rescue attempt they were planning. Intel estimates we have a 4-hour window before daylight makes extraction impossible. Morrison's voice came through the encrypted communications link. After that, any rescue attempt becomes a daylight operation with full Chinese air defense coverage. 4 hours to fly 800 miles, land on a potentially hostile airstrip, load 6 passengers, and escape before superior forces could respond. It was the kind of timeline that left no margin for error, no time for second thoughts or alternative planning. Kat strapped herself into the left seat of the MC-130J, adjusting the night vision goggles that would be her primary means of navigation during the low-level approach. The aircraft around her hummed with electronic activity, systems coming online in the systematic sequence that transformed a collection of metal and wiring into a flying machine capable of transcontinental flight. Pre-flight complete, Santos announced. All systems green, fuel load at maximum, defensive systems checked and ready. Weather at the target is clear, winds light and variable, Liu added. Forecast holds through our recovery window. As the MC-130J taxied toward the runway, Kat felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like an old, uncomfortable coat. 6 Americans were depending on her skills, her judgment, her ability to make the right decisions under pressure. But unlike her fighter missions, where she'd been responsible primarily for herself and her aircraft, this operation involved the lives of her crew as well as the aircrew they were rescuing. The runway lights stretched ahead like a pathway to whatever waited beyond the horizon. Success or failure, heroism or disaster measured in split-second decisions, and the unforgiving physics of flight. Yokota Tower, Spear 1, ready for departure. Spear 1, Yokota Tower, winds calm, runway 18 clear for takeoff. Godspeed. The MC-130J rolled forward, gathering momentum with the steady acceleration of 29,000 pounds of thrust, pushing against 164,000 pounds of aircraft, fuel, and equipment. Kat felt the familiar transition from ground vehicle to aircraft, the moment when lift overcame weight and the earth fell away beneath them. But this time, instead of the exhilarating rush of a fighter launch, she experienced the steady, purposeful climb of a machine built for endurance rather than speed. Positive rate, gear up, she called, following the ancient ritual of departure. Gear up and locked, Liu responded, her voice carrying the calm professionalism that marked exceptional aircrew. They climbed into the Pacific night, navigation lights extinguished, radar transponder silent, becoming a ghost in the darkness above the ocean. The defensive systems were already active, electronic ears listening for the telltale signatures of enemy radar and missile systems. For now, the night was quiet, but that would change as they approached the contested waters around the disputed island. At 500 feet above the ocean, Kat leveled off and began the delicate process of terrain-following flight. The MC-130J's radar painted the water's surface in green lines on her display, showing wave heights and surface conditions with remarkable precision. But for the final approach, they would fly below even this altitude, skimming the ocean at heights that left no room for error. Navigation update, Sergeant Williams called from his station. On course, on time. Target bearing 285 degrees, distance 347 miles. Defensive systems passive, Rodriguez reported. No radar illumination detected, communication spectrum clear. The ocean below them was an endless expanse of black water, occasionally broken by the white foam of wave caps or the distant lights of commercial shipping. It was a reminder of how small they were in the vast Pacific, how easily an aircraft could simply disappear without a trace if something went wrong. But it was also their ally, providing the featureless terrain that made low-level penetration possible. 2 hours into the flight, everything changed. Radar contact, bearing 45, range 80 miles, Williams called, his voice tight with sudden tension. Multiple contacts appears to be a surface action group. The Chinese destroyer task force, exactly where intelligence had predicted, but somehow more threatening now that it appeared on their scopes. Cat could see the tactical display updating in real time, showing the positions of at least 6 warships arranged in a defensive pattern around the disputed island. Electronic warfare activity detected, Rodriguez added. Search radar's active, frequency agile, appears to be coordinated sweep pattern. They were still outside the effective range of the Chinese radars, but that advantage wouldn't last long. Modern naval air defense systems could detect aircraft at ranges exceeding 200 miles under ideal conditions. The MC-130J's stealth modifications would help, but they weren't invisible, just harder to see. Time to go low, Cat announced, pushing the aircraft's nose down toward the ocean surface. The descent to 50 feet above the water was like entering another world entirely. At this altitude, the ocean ceased to be an abstract surface and became a living, breathing entity. Wave patterns became obstacles to navigate around, and the aircraft's radar altimeter provided a constant stream of warnings about their proximity to the water. One mistake, one moment of inattention, and 164,000 pounds of aircraft would disappear beneath the Pacific in seconds. Altitude 50 feet and holding, Liu called, her voice steady despite the inherent danger of their flight profile. Surface search radar detected, bearing 320, Rodriguez announced. Appears to be ship-based system, probably from the destroyer group. Flying at 50 feet above the ocean was like threading a needle while riding a roller coaster. The MC-130J responded to every air current, every thermal variation, with the sensitivity of a massive tuning fork. Cat's hands were constantly active on the controls, making tiny adjustments to keep them at precisely the right altitude, low enough to avoid radar detection, high enough to avoid flying into the ocean. The island appeared on their radar scopes like a jagged tooth rising from the ocean floor, its mountainous spine creating the kind of terrain that could hide an aircraft from electronic detection. But it also created treacherous flying conditions, with wind patterns and air currents that could slam an unwary pilot into solid rock without warning. Target island bearing 285, range 12 miles, Williams reported, beginning final approach navigation. This was the most dangerous part of the mission, the transition from ocean flight to landing approach, where they would be most vulnerable to detection and engagement. Chinese forces on the island would be watching and listening, their own electronic systems scanning the night for any sign of incoming aircraft. Defensive systems to active mode, Cat ordered. If anyone paints us with targeting radar, I want to know immediately. The MC-130J ghosted through the night toward whatever waited on the disputed island, carrying 6 lives in its cargo bay, and the hopes of 6 more stranded aircrew members who had no idea rescue was coming. The island's single airstrip appeared in their night vision like a gray scar across volcanic rock, barely visible even with the sophisticated sensors at their disposal. The runway was exactly as advertised, 6,000 feet of cracked concrete left over from World War II, with no approach lights, no navigation aids, and no margin for error. At the far end, Kat could see the distinctive silhouette of the downed EP-3, sitting like a wounded bird beside what appeared to be hastily constructed defensive positions. "Visual contact with the target aircraft," she announced quietly. "EP-3 appears intact, positioned at the eastern end of the runway." "I've got movement around the aircraft," Captain Liu added, adjusting her night vision display. "Looks like personnel, maybe 6 or 8 individuals. The Chinese Special Operations Team. They would be professional soldiers, well-equipped and alert to the possibility of exactly this kind of rescue attempt. But they would also be operating under political constraints, aware that any firefight with American forces could escalate into an international incident neither government wanted." "Beginning approach," Kat called, configuring the MC-130J for landing. "Flaps to approach setting, landing lights off, engines to minimum power." The approach to the island runway was a masterpiece of precision flying, threading between mountain peaks in complete darkness while maintaining the kind of flight profile that left no room for second-guessing. Kat used every technique she'd learned in 2 decades of military flying, reading wind patterns by the feel of the aircraft, judging distances by the subtle changes in terrain features visible through night vision. 50 feet above touchdown zone," Liu called, reading off altitude with the precision of a surgical instrument. 30 feet, 20, 10. The MC-130J's main landing gear touched the concrete with barely a whisper, the aircraft's weight settling onto the runway with the gentle grace of an aircraft designed for operations in hostile territory. Kat immediately deployed the thrust reversers, bringing them to a stop well short of the downed EP-3. "We're down," she announced. "Engines running, ready for immediate departure." The cargo ramp was already lowering as Master Sergeant Rodriguez coordinated the loading operation. Through her night vision, Kat could see figures moving near the EP-3, the American aircrew, finally understanding that rescue had arrived. But she could also see other movement in the darkness around the perimeter, the Chinese Special Operations Team repositioning to monitor the situation. "American aircrew boarding now," Rodriguez reported over the intercom. 6 souls, all ambulatory, no apparent injuries. The loading process took exactly 4 minutes, an eternity when operating in hostile territory, but remarkably fast for a nighttime evacuation under combat conditions. Kat kept the engines running at idle power, ready for immediate departure if the tactical situation changed. "All personnel aboard," Rodriguez announced. "Cargo ramp secure, ready for departure." But as Kat prepared to taxi for takeoff, the radio crackled with an unexpected transmission, in English, with a slight accent that could only be Chinese. "American aircraft, this is Colonel Zhang, People's Liberation Army. You are operating in Chinese territorial waters without authorization. Power down your engines and prepare for inspection." The moment of truth had arrived. Everything they'd planned for, everything they'd trained for, now reduced to a single decision point. Comply with the Chinese demand and risk becoming hostages themselves, or ignore the warning and risk triggering the kind of international incident that could spiral out of control. But 6 American aircrew members sat in her cargo bay, depending on her judgment and her willingness to accept risk on their behalf. "Colonel Zhang," Kat replied, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd faced similar situations before. "This is Major Voss, United States Air Force. We are conducting a humanitarian rescue operation for aircrew members who made an emergency landing due to mechanical failure. We will be departing immediately." She didn't wait for a response. The MC-130J rolled forward, gathering speed on the dark runway while Chinese Special Operations troops watched from the shadows. This was the most dangerous moment of the entire mission, the few seconds when they were committed to takeoff but not yet airborne, vulnerable to small arms fire or worse. The aircraft lifted off into the Pacific night, climbing away from the disputed island with 6 rescued Americans and a crew that had just proved that sometimes the right thing to do was also the most dangerous thing to do. The flight back to Yokota was conducted in complete radio silence, the MC-130J ghosting through international airspace, while Chinese naval forces scrambled to understand what had just happened. CAT maintained their low-level flight profile until they were well clear of any potential surface-to-air missile range, only then climbing to cruise altitude and normal flight operations. "How are our passengers?" she asked Rodriguez over the intercom. "Shaken but grateful, ma'am. The EP-3 crew says they had no idea the Chinese had landed on the island until they saw troops setting up positions around their aircraft. They thought it was just going to be a routine mechanical recovery." In the cargo bay, 6 American aircrew members sat on web seats, wrapped in Air Force-issue blankets and trying to process their transition from potential international hostages to rescued personnel. They were intelligence specialists and aircrew from the EP-3 reconnaissance community, professionals who understood the geopolitical implications of their situation better than most. Technical Sergeant Maria Santos, no relation to the MC-130J's aircraft commander, was the senior enlisted member of the downed crew. She made her way forward to the cockpit, moving with the careful balance of someone adapting to aircraft motion after days on the ground. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you and your crew personally," she said, her voice carrying the emotional weight of someone who'd just been given her life back. "We weren't sure anyone was coming for us." "Sergeant, we don't leave people behind," Kat replied simply. "That's not how we operate." But privately, she wondered if that was still true. The military she'd left 3 years ago had been fighting wars where the enemy was clearly defined, and the mission parameters were relatively simple. This operation had required her to make decisions that balanced tactical necessity against strategic implications, where a single mistake could have triggered consequences far beyond the immediate mission. "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" Santos continued. "Back there on the island when the Chinese officer demanded we shut down, you didn't even hesitate. How did you know that was the right call?" Kat was quiet for a moment, thinking about the split-second decision that had defined the mission's success. "Sergeant, sometimes you don't know if you're making the right decision. You just know you're making the necessary one." As the lights of Japan appeared on the horizon ahead, Kat felt the familiar weight of mission completion settling over her like an old, comfortable blanket. They'd accomplished their objective, brought home 6 Americans who might otherwise have become pawns in a larger geopolitical game. But she also knew that this mission had changed something fundamental in her relationship with military service. For 3 years, she'd convinced herself that she was done with the burden of command, the weight of other people's lives, the impossible choices that came with military leadership. But sitting in the cockpit of the MC-130J, surrounded by professionals who trusted her judgment in the most critical circumstances, she realized that some responsibilities couldn't be abandoned, only temporarily set aside. The landing at Yokota was anticlimactic after the tension of the island operation. Standard approach, normal runway, and the welcoming lights of an American airbase where no one was shooting at them or demanding they power down their engines. As the MC-130J rolled to a stop at the Special Operations ramp, Kat could see the reception committee waiting. Medical personnel, intelligence debriefers, and senior officers who would want to understand every detail of what had just transpired. Colonel Morrison was first up the cargo ramp when it lowered, his face showing a mixture of relief and professional satisfaction. Behind him came Air Force medical technicians who immediately began assessing the rescued EP-3 crew, checking for injuries or medical issues that might have developed during their time on the disputed island. "Outstanding work," Morrison said quietly as Kat shut down the MC-130J systems. "Clean extraction, no injuries, no international incident. Washington is very pleased." But Kat wasn't thinking about Washington's pleasure or the mission's strategic success. She was thinking about Technical Sergeant Santos's question, about the moment when she'd made the decision to ignore Colonel Zhang's demand and take off anyway. It hadn't been a calculated risk assessment or a strategic decision based on policy guidelines. It had been pure instinct, the kind of split-second judgment that came from 22 years of military training and 3 combat deployments. The instinct of someone who still thought like a military officer, regardless of what her discharge papers said about medical retirement. The debriefing lasted 6 hours, every detail of the mission dissected and analyzed by intelligence specialists who would use the information to understand Chinese capabilities and intentions. Kat answered questions with military precision, describing flight profiles and tactical procedures, electronic warfare signatures and defensive measures. But the personal dimension of the mission, the moment when she decided to trust her judgment again, remained unspoken. Major Voss, the senior intelligence officer, finally said, "Your assessment of Chinese special operations capabilities based on what you observed." "Professional, well-equipped, disciplined," she replied. They had clear rules of engagement that prevented escalation, but they were prepared for a fight if necessary. This wasn't a random deployment. They knew exactly what they were doing. It was a tactful way of saying that the Chinese military had anticipated the rescue mission and prepared accordingly, positioning forces and establishing procedures that balanced their territorial claims against the risk of military confrontation with the United States. They'd been playing a more sophisticated game than simple hostage-taking. As the debriefing concluded, and the various officials dispersed to write their reports and brief their superiors, Colonel Morrison approached Kat with the expression of someone who had a difficult conversation ahead. "We need to talk," he said quietly, "privately." They walked to Morrison's temporary office in the operations building, a sterile space that could have been anywhere in the Air Force bureaucracy. He closed the door behind them and activated a white noise generator that would defeat most electronic surveillance, the kind of operational security measure that meant the conversation was about to become very serious. "Kat, what you did tonight was exceptional flying under extremely difficult conditions, the kind of mission that gets written up in classified after-action reports and studied at staff colleges." Morrison paused, choosing his words carefully. "But it was also the kind of mission that raises questions about why someone with your capabilities is teaching teenagers to fly Piper Cherokees in Montana." She'd been expecting this conversation from the moment she'd agreed to the mission. Morrison wasn't just her former commanding officer. He was a friend who'd watched her walk away from a career that had defined her identity for 2 decades. He understood better than most what it had cost her to leave, and what it might cost her to stay away. "Jim, we've been through this. I'm not the pilot I used to be. Torch's death proved that." Torch's death proved that military operations involve risk, and sometimes good people die despite everyone's best efforts, Morrison replied firmly. "What happened tonight proved that you're still one of the best tactical pilots in the Air Force, retired or not." Through the office window, she could see the lights of aircraft moving through the night, cargo planes, fighters, tankers, the endless stream of military aviation that kept American forces supplied and ready around the world. It was a reminder of the larger mission she'd once been part of, the vast enterprise of national defense that required people willing to accept extraordinary responsibility. "The Air Force is changing," Morrison continued. "New threats, new technologies, new missions that require exactly the kind of experience you bring to the table. We need pilots who can think tactically, who can operate in contested environments, who can make the hard decisions under pressure. And if I make the wrong decision, if I lead someone else into an ambush like I led Torch." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the harsh fluorescent lighting. "Kat, you can't fly for the rest of your career trying to prevent something that already happened. Torch's death was a tragedy, but it wasn't your failure. It was war." But war, Kat thought, was exactly what she'd been trying to avoid for the past 3 years. The moral complexity, the impossible choices, the weight of command that measured success in terms of lives saved and lost. Tonight's mission had reminded her why she'd walked away, and why some part of her had never really left. The hotel room overlooked Tokyo Bay, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of one of the world's busiest harbors. Kat stood at the window in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the lights of commercial shipping move through the channels between the massive container terminals. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, 6 American aircrew members were sleeping in their own beds for the first time in a week, reunited with families who'd feared the worst. Her reflection in the window showed a woman who looked older than her 43 years, gray threads beginning to silver her dark hair, lines around her eyes that spoke of too many hours squinting into bright skis, and too many nights lying awake thinking about missions gone wrong. But her hands were steady. Her posture still carried the unconscious confidence of someone accustomed to command, and her eyes held the kind of alertness that came from a lifetime of making decisions where lives hung in the balance. The secure phone on the bedside table buzzed with an encrypted message from Morrison. "Washington wants to meet with you before you return to Montana. Defense Secretary's office, tomorrow at 1400 hours. This is about more than last night's mission." She deleted the message without responding, but she already knew what the meeting would involve. The Pentagon had a way of identifying exceptional performance and attempting to institutionalize it, to transform individual competence into systemic capability. They would offer her a return to active duty, probably with promotion and choice of assignment, the kind of deal that recognized both her capabilities and her past service. But they would also expect her to commit fully to military life again, to accept the weight of command and the burden of training young pilots who might someday face the same impossible choices that had defined her own career. The thought of watching another eager young aviator transform from idealistic patriot to combat-hardened professional, or worse, to casualty statistic, made her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. Her laptop chimed with an email from Tommy Garrison, her student back in Montana. "Miss Voss, I saw the news about some kind of rescue mission in the Pacific. The reporter said a retired Air Force pilot was involved. That wasn't you, was it? When are we going to finish my solo work?" The kid's innocent question cut through the complex geopolitical implications of the mission like a knife through paper. While she'd been navigating international airspace and making split-second decisions that could have triggered military confrontation between major powers, Tommy had been worried about completing his basic flight training, focused on the simple joy of learning to fly. That world, the world of civilian aviation instruction, of teaching the pure mechanics of flight without the overlay of combat tactics or strategic objectives, suddenly seemed very far away. But it also represented something she'd almost forgotten during the intensity of the rescue mission: the possibility of flight without violence, of aviation as exploration rather than warfare. She opened her laptop and began typing a response. "Tommy, I was called away on some temporary Air Force business, but I'll be back in Montana soon. We'll finish your solo work and get you ready for your check ride. Keep studying those emergency procedures. They're more important than you think." As she hit send, Kat realized she'd made her decision about Morrison's offer, about Washington's interest in her return to active duty, about the choice between the life she'd built and the life she'd left behind. Some responsibilities couldn't be abandoned, only temporarily set aside, but some freedoms once tasted were too precious to surrender again. The meeting at the Pentagon was everything she'd expected and more. Defense Secretary Patricia Hawkins was a former senator who'd built her reputation on military oversight and defense policy, a woman who understood both the strategic necessities of national defense and the human cost of military operations. She sat across from Kat in a secure conference room, flanked by senior Air Force officers who represented the institutional weight of America's military aviation enterprise. "Major Voss, Your performance during the Pacific Rescue Operation was exceptional by any measure, Secretary Hawkins began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected millions of lives. The kind of tactical flying and leadership we need more of, not less of. General Patricia Rodriguez, the Air Force Chief of Staff, leaned forward slightly. Major, we're prepared to offer you immediate return to active duty with promotion to Lieutenant Colonel, your choice of assignment within the Special Operations community. Test pilot school if you're interested. Command track if you want to lead. The offers were generous, recognition of both her demonstrated capabilities and the Air Force's need for experienced pilots in an increasingly complex strategic environment. But Kat had spent 3 years learning to value different measures of success: students who learned to fly safely, young pilots who discovered the joy of aviation without the burden of combat, the simple satisfaction of teaching skills that brought freedom rather than destruction. Secretary Hawkins, General Rodriguez, I'm honored by your confidence, Kat replied carefully. But I've found meaningful work in civilian aviation instruction, teaching the next generation of pilots, helping them discover what flight can mean when it's not constrained by military necessity. Major, with respect, teaching basic flight instruction in Montana is a waste of your talents, General Rodriguez said bluntly. The Air Force invested millions of dollars in your training, and the nation needs pilots with your experience and judgment. But Secretary Hawkins held up a hand, studying Kat with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to read people through decades of political and military service. General, perhaps we're approaching this from the wrong angle. Major Voss, what if we could structure an arrangement that allowed you to contribute to national defense while maintaining your civilian flying instruction work? The proposal that emerged from the next 2 hours of discussion was unlike anything in Kat's experience with military bureaucracy. A reserve commission that would require her to participate in special operations training and be available for specific high-priority missions, but would allow her to maintain her civilian career and Montana residence. It was a recognition that some capabilities were too valuable to waste, but too fragile to constrain within traditional military structures. You'd be part of a new program we're developing, Secretary Hawkins explained. Experienced pilots who can bridge the gap between civilian expertise and military necessity. Crisis response, specialized training, the kind of missions that require someone who can think outside normal military parameters. It wasn't the simple choice between military and civilian life that Kat had expected. It was something more complex, an acknowledgement that the skills she developed over 2 decades of military service had value beyond traditional combat roles, that her experience as a civilian flight instructor might actually enhance her military capabilities rather than diminish them. I need time to think about this, she said finally. Of course, Secretary Hawkins replied. But Major, don't take too long. The world is becoming more complex, and we need people who can navigate that complexity with wisdom and experience. People like you. As Kat walked through the Pentagon's corridors toward the exit, she passed displays honoring military aviation history, photographs of aircraft and aircrew from World War II through the present day, reminders of the continuity of service that stretch back through generations of Americans who'd chosen to serve their country through military aviation. But she also thought about Tommy Garrison, waiting back in Montana for his next flight lesson, eager to experience the simple joy of leaving the ground behind. The two worlds, military service and civilian instruction, no longer seemed mutually exclusive. Perhaps there was a way to honor both the complexity of national defense and the simplicity of flight instruction, to serve her country while teaching the next generation that aviation could be about more than warfare. The Montana sky stretched endless and clear as Kat guided the Piper Cherokee through the practice area west of Silver Creek Regional Airport, Tommy Garrison in the right seat, working through advanced maneuvers with the focused intensity of a student pilot who discovered his calling. 2 weeks had passed since the Pentagon meeting, 2 weeks of considering the Reserve Commission offer, while returning to the routine of civilian flight instruction. "Steep turns to the left, 45 degrees of bank," she called, watching Tommy's technique as he rolled the Cherokee into the training maneuver. His hands were smooth on the controls now, no longer the jerky inputs of a beginning student, but the confident movements of someone who'd learned to trust his own judgment. In 6 months of instruction, she'd watched him transform from an eager ranch kid who dreamed of flying into a pilot who understood the responsibility that came with flight. "Altitude holding, airspeed steady," Tommy reported, completing the maneuver with textbook precision. "Good, now let's practice some emergency procedures. Engine failure at pattern altitude." Tommy's response was immediate and correct. Reduce power to idle, establish best glide airspeed, pick a landing site, run the emergency checklist. It was the kind of training that might someday save his life, the fundamental skills that every pilot needed regardless of whether they flew for recreation, commerce, or military service. As they headed back toward the airport for landing practice, Kat's phone buzzed with a text message from Colonel Morrison. "Chinese government filed formal complaint about unauthorized military operation in disputed territory. Washington is calling it a diplomatic protest. Congratulations, you just helped prevent a war by fighting one." The irony wasn't lost on her. While she'd been worried about the military implications of the rescue mission, the larger strategic effect had been to demonstrate American resolve without escalating to actual combat. Sometimes the best military operations were the ones that prevented wars rather than fighting them. "Miss Voss, can I ask you something?" Tommy said as they entered the traffic pattern for Silver Creek. "Sure." "That mission you flew in the Pacific, the news said it was some kind of rescue operation. What's it like, flying when people's lives depend on what you do?" It was the same question Technical Sergeant Santos had asked after the island extraction, the same question Kat had been asking herself for 3 years. What was it like to carry that weight, to make decisions where failure meant other people died? "Tommy, every time you fly an aircraft, someone's life depends on what you do, starting with your own," she said as they turned final for runway 27. "The only difference between civilian and military flying is the number of people affected by your decisions. But the fundamental responsibility is the same: bring everyone home safely." The Cherokee touched down with barely a whisper, Tommy's landing technique smooth and controlled. As they taxied back to the ramp, Kat made her decision about the Pentagon's offer, about the Reserve Commission that would allow her to serve both worlds. That evening, she called Colonel Morrison to accept the terms of the reserve assignment. It would mean periodic training deployments, availability for special operations missions, and the return of military responsibility to her life. But it would also mean she could continue teaching students like Tommy, could maintain the balance between service and instruction that gave meaning to both roles. "Jim, I'll take the Reserve Commission," she said when Morrison answered the secure phone. "But I have conditions." "Name them." "I continue my civilian flight instruction work. No permanent change of station unless it's a genuine national emergency. And I get to choose which missions I participate in. No routine deployments, no make-work assignments." Morrison was quiet for a moment, probably checking with higher authority through secure communications. "Done," he said finally. "Welcome back to the Air Force, Colonel Voss." "Colonel." The promotion was recognition of her demonstrated leadership during the Pacific Rescue Mission, acknowledgement that her capabilities had grown beyond her previous rank. But more than that, it was recognition that military service could take different forms, that the Air Force needed people who could think beyond traditional boundaries. As Kat hung up the phone and looked out at the Montana sky, she realized that her journey from active duty through medical retirement to civilian instruction and back to military service had taught her something fundamental about the nature of responsibility. It wasn't about the uniform you wore or the organization you served. It was about the willingness to use your skills when they were needed most. 6 months later, Tommy Garrison passed his private pilot check ride with the same precision he'd brought to every aspect of his flight training. Kat watched from the flight school office as he completed his oral exam with the designated examiner, answering questions about weather, regulations, and emergency procedures with the confidence of someone who'd learned not just the mechanics of flight, but the judgment that made flying safe. When the examiner finally shook Tommy's hand and said the words every student pilot dreams of hearing, "Congratulations, you're a pilot," Kat felt the same satisfaction she'd once experienced watching young military aviators earn their wings. Different context, different objectives, but the same fundamental achievement. Someone had learned to fly, had accepted the responsibility that came with flight, had joined the community of people who understood what it meant to slip the surly bonds of Earth. "Miss Voss, Colonel Voss, I couldn't have done this without you," Tommy said when he found her after the check ride. "You taught me more than just flying. You taught me that being a pilot means more than just handling the controls." It was true, though she'd never thought of it in those terms. Flight instruction was about more than technical skills. It was about judgment, responsibility, and the kind of decision-making that could mean the difference between a routine flight and a tragedy. The same qualities that made someone a good military pilot also made them a good civilian pilot. Her phone buzzed with a message from Morrison. "New situation developing in the South China Sea. Volunteer basis only, but we could use someone with your experience and judgment. Interested?" This time, Kat didn't hesitate before responding. She'd found her balance between the two worlds of military service and civilian instruction, had learned that responsibility could take many forms, but always required the willingness to step forward when skills were needed. "Count me in," she texted back. As she walked out to the flight line where her own aircraft waited, a restored P-51 Mustang she'd bought with money saved from her civilian instruction work, Kat reflected on the path that had brought her from the cockpit of an F-16 through medical retirement to civilian instruction and back to military service. It hadn't been a straight line, hadn't followed any career progression chart or military personnel manual. But it had been authentic to who she was. A pilot who understood that flight was about more than leaving the ground, that aviation was fundamentally about taking responsibility for other people's lives and safety. Whether she was teaching a teenager to fly or extracting prisoners from a disputed island, the core requirement was the same: competence, judgment, and the willingness to make hard decisions when they mattered most. The P-51's Merlin engine came to life with the distinctive growl that had once struck fear into enemy pilots over Europe and the Pacific. As Kat taxied out for an evening flight over the Montana mountains, she smiled at the thought that her story, from active duty through retirement to reserve service, was just beginning. There would be more students to train, more missions to fly, more impossible choices to make in the space between ground and sky. But she'd learned that running away from responsibility only made you tired, that some obligations couldn't be abandoned, only temporarily set aside. The P-51 lifted off into the endless Montana sky, carrying a pilot who'd finally learned that service came in many forms, that the most important battles were often fought not with weapons, but with wisdom, not with violence, but with the simple willingness to step forward when others needed help. In the distance, commercial aircraft traced contrails across the deepening sky, their navigation lights blinking in the steady rhythm of routine flight. But Kat knew that somewhere, other pilots were facing the same choices she'd faced: the decision between safety and service, between personal comfort and professional obligation, between the mission you wanted and the mission that needed doing. As the sun set behind the Rocky Mountains and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Colonel Katerina, Reaper, Voss flew west toward whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, secure in the knowledge that she'd finally learned the difference between running away from responsibility and choosing how to carry it. The radio crackled with routine air traffic control transmissions, the familiar voices of pilots and controllers coordinating the safe movement of aircraft through controlled airspace. But underneath it all, Kat could hear the deeper music of aviation itself, the sound of humans refusing to be bound by gravity, the eternal conversation between wing and wind that had captured her imagination 30 years ago and still held her now. She was sleeping in row 6 when the captain asked if any military pilots were on board, but she was awake now, fully awake, and ready for whatever mission came next. Some stories end with retirement, with the peaceful conclusion of a career dedicated to service. But other stories understand that true service never really ends. It just changes form, adapts to new circumstances, finds new ways to contribute to the ancient human dream of flight. Kat's story was the latter kind, and as the P-51 disappeared into the Montana night, its engine note fading to a whisper among the mountains, the sky itself seemed to acknowledge that some pilots never really land. They just keep flying, keep serving, keep carrying the responsibility that comes with the privilege of flight. In her wake, the lights of Silver Creek Regional Airport continued their nightly vigil, beacons guiding other aviators safely home. Tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, new opportunities to pass along the lessons learned through 2 decades of military service and 3 years of civilian instruction. But tonight, under a canopy of stars that stretched from horizon to horizon, Colonel Katerina Voss flew alone with her memories and her dreams, a pilot who'd learned that the sky was big enough for all the contradictions of modern military service, all the complexities of duty and choice that define the profession of arms in the 21st century. The mission continued, as it always had, as it always would. And somewhere in row 6 of another aircraft, another sleeping pilot waited for their moment to step forward, to accept the weight of other people's lives, to prove that service came in many forms but always required the same fundamental courage, the willingness to fly toward danger rather than away from it. The sky remembered them all, every pilot who'd ever chosen service over safety, mission accomplishment over personal comfort, the needs of others.